This is a project I started, well, actually completed this a number of years ago. Started with Jordan Weeks when he was the biologist out of La Crosse, and I kind of finished it up with Kirk when he took over Jordan's position. And it wasn't a harvest-oriented study per se, but it was a kind of a study set around the question of, do we have too many trout in some of our driftless streams such that it's impeding growth? And if we reduce density, could we see some improvements in growth in trout? So Jordan and I decided to pursue this, and we did this on Spring Coulee Creek. So this is one of the streams in Jordan's area. This got me involved on Spring Coulee, and I've kind of kept it on as a monitoring site since then. It was one of those just really high density brown trout streams. I'm sure many of you have fished it. And I know when Jordan was doing surveys on it, you get a lot of tubs of fish like this, just a lot of these 6 to 10 inch trout, a lot of them looking kind of thin, and kind of raised the question of, if we reduce their density a bit, can we get some better growth out of these fish? So that's what we set out to do. So this is a picture of Spring Coulee. This is on Rod Ofty's farm, Willow Creek Farm. So this is our study site. And this is again in Vernon County over in the Driftless area. So the idea behind what we're doing, reducing trout density to look at effects on growth. But we figured to get the best bang for the buck, instead of trying to entice anglers to come here and catch fish and reduce the density, we would do it ourselves. And the approach we took to the study. A little bit of background for fishing in the area. Now, I guess everybody's kind of familiar that a lot of people are catch and release anglers these days. And we've certainly seen this in the creel surveys that we've done on Timber Coulee. This is a little bit of data, some of it from 1984, going back to Bob Hunt and Ed Avery when they were working in DNR. And then more recently, Jordan had done a creel survey back in 2008. And just comparing the two, back in 1980s, it was very much a harvest-oriented fishery. You were getting 0.4 trout per hour harvested. So if somebody's fishing 10 hours, they're harvesting 4 trout. And in a 1.6 mile section of that stream of Timber Coulee, where Bob Hunt did his study, he estimated about 1,800 trout were kept in 1984. So pretty large number of trout kept out of a small section of Timber Coulee. Presumably this was happening throughout Timber Coulee. When we did a creel survey in 2008, it was quite the opposite. Catch rates were still kind of similar, but the harvest rate was down by an order of magnitude. So it would be maybe 100 hours of fishing before somebody would keep 4 trout. And now regulations had changed. In 2008, it was catch and release only downstream of Ulstad Road Bridge. And I think you can keep 5 under 12 upstream from there. So we looked at estimating the harvest rate for that section of stream upstream from Ulstad Bridge, and found that in that 4 miles of stream in 2008, we estimated about 119 fish were being kept. So quite a lot less, or quite a lot fewer trout being kept in 2008 versus a few decades earlier. So very much a catch and release fishery. Also a destination fishery. This is distance traveled to Timber Coulee Creek. And again, back in 1984, see at the bottom of this graph, it's very much a local fishery. About 90% of the people fishing it that were in the creel, captured in the creel survey, were traveling less than 25 miles to fish Timber Coulee. 2008, and again 2016, very much the opposite. About 80% of the people fishing Timber Coulee were traveling over 50 miles to get there. So kind of a much different group of anglers fishing Timber Coulee. So very high densities of trout in these streams, Timber Coulee, Spring Coulee, they're right close to each other. And different type of angling these days, not as many people keeping them. Is that why there are that many fish in the stream? I don't, well, won't get into that, but just briefly, the methods that we did in the study, we looked at removing trout to lower density. So we did the removal ourselves. Following up on that, we did some tag recapture in the spring and in the fall, 2013 through 2017, estimating survival and movement rates. With the idea being, we couldn't lower density in the entire stream. It was just would have been physically impossible. So we chose it's a roughly 400-meter site on Rodofsky's farm to do this, and then we did some sampling in adjacent sections upstream and downstream. And so that involved the tag recapture, just to look at if fish are moving back in this section, or if we were effectively keeping densities down. And then obviously the thing we were trying to look at was changes in size structure, body condition, and growth rates. So this is what we removed from a 400-meter section of spring coulee back in 2013. The bar graph on the top, the clear or white bars are all the fish that we captured, and then I shaded in green the ones we removed. So in that 400-meter section of stream, we caught 878 brown trout. 808 of them went on a truck, and Jordan took them down to Chaseburg, let them go back in Coon Creek. So, and we only took fish that were under 12 inches. So we were just kind of mimicking harvesting smaller fish and leaving the trophy fish in there. That was in the late summer, early fall of 2013. Went back in the spring of 2014 and removed a little bit more. Caught a lot fewer then, about 381, and took about 100 of those out and moved them down. And in the spring, you start to see the this is a little bit later in the spring, starting to see some of the young year showing up in the survey. So what we found, looked at a number of different models for estimating survival, found that survival varied by time from year to year. Survival rates in the 0.35 to 0.6, so about 35 to 60% of trout surviving from one year to the next. And the main rate we were looking at, though, was movement, and the movement rate was 0.04. So for these fish that we were tagging in the section where we removed most of the fish but left some there, and then tagging a lot of fish upstream and downstream, we were seeing very little movement among those adjacent sections of the stream. So that was good. We were not simply having all these trout flooding back into the removal section right away. What we found when we were looking at relative abundance over time, we were in these different sections of the stream. In 2013, this is when densities were higher, right before we removed the fish. By 2014, densities had actually were lower everywhere. So not just in the treatment section, the bar shown in red where we took these fish out of, but upstream and downstream as well. We were not seeing as many fish throughout the stream. And that kind of persisted into 2015. And then by 2016, 2017, numbers started building up again. So what we think happened, I have to look back at temperature data, but I think that was one of those really, really cold winters that occurred a number of years ago. And it really knocked down trout numbers in a lot of streams around the Driftless area and other parts of the state. So although we did a number on these fish by removing them, Mother Nature came in and kind of took over and did the rest. This is just some length frequency histograms of what we saw in these different sections over time. So it's kind of hard to see the larger fish that are showing up, but we're getting every now and then a fish or two, maybe up in the 17, 18, 19-inch range within that 400-meter section, and sometimes upstream or downstream. And what we were really interested in was looking at growth of these fish. So one way was looking at the relative body condition. And here we're looking at an analysis of the mean of the residual. So basically what this is, if you took the length and weight of trout, so we took the length and weight of all the trout that we would catch in these sections, and you plot them out, as length increases, weight increases, and ideally, if you're seeing better growth, you're going to get a shift in that curve and see larger or a higher weight at a given length. And in 2013, comparing the relative body condition of the treatment section versus the two adjacent sections, the body condition where we were finding those large numbers of kind of thin-looking fish, This red symbol here with the A next to it, it was significantly lower than it was in the two other sections, which is kind of interesting. We thought they might be somewhat similar at that time. By 2014, we did see a significant increase in growth in that removal section where we lowered the density. So then, that had gone up, but then by 2015 and 2016 and on, things started to revert back to where it was. So as the fish number started building up again over time, growth started going down a little bit in that removal section. One other way to look at that is by all sites combined. So here was the three different sites. The treatment site showed in red, and upstream and downstream of that. Looking at all sites combined was kind of paint a little bit better picture of what was going on. So in, again, 2013 is when density was really high in spring coulee, and the relative growth in 2013 was quite low compared to 4 subsequent years. Again, 2014, 2015, we had that really harsh winter, densities of trout went down everywhere, and we did see a response in growth in those couple of years, so it really went up. And then as trout numbers started to build up again into 2016, 2017, growth rates went down a little bit. So this is kind of evidence that trout growth is responding somewhat to changes in density. And then this is just one more way of looking at growth. This is instantaneous growth rate. So we got this, and here it's just looking at fish in kind of that 8 to 12 inch range. We were using pit tags on some of these fish, so we're getting individual data. So we can look over time on how these fish are growing. And again, this is what it looked like. Growth rates were kind of low, or instantaneous growth rates somewhat lower during 2013. When densities got knocked down, they popped up. And then over time, as the density started increasing again, the growth rate started decreasing. So general conclusions from this: body condition and growth can improve in response to a decrease in density. But then that gets into the question of, should we or can we as management agency do anything about that? Should we be trucking fish down to Chaseburg to lower density, or letting people catch and keep more? But in this study, it turned out the annual variability in trout population dynamics was kind of likely to preclude any persistently high densities, and that may negate the need for any active intervention. So again, and you're probably all aware of this, just the variability in weather conditions that we've been seeing, seeing some of these years where we get these really big floods that knock down numbers, or we had a really cold winter in the case during this study. Things like that are also changing densities as well. So it's very unlikely that you're going to see these persistently high densities just year after year after year. Now, not to say it can't happen, but Mother Nature does come in and play a part as well. I think I'll pause there if there's any questions in particular about that work. And if not, I'll just move on.
Yes, I have a question.
Yep.
So Matt, back in the day when David Toronto was involved, he did a 10-year study on the West Fork where he went in October, the first week of October. Season closed on the 15th of September, and he shocked section 300 meters, same 300 meters, which is now owned by the West Fork Sportsman's Club. And what we noticed after a couple of years, we would go upstream, a couple of holes upstream, and the big fish would get the heck out of there, like right now, as fast as they could swim. Was there any way that you would close off the stream so you would have a chance of maybe capturing all the big fish in the study?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we noticed that too.
By the way, Dave never did, the study was that what he was concerned about was the effects of catch and release fishing, because the West Fork was all catch and release at the time. So he wanted to do a study on it, and he never did publish that as far as I know.
Yeah, I don't recall seeing that data either. Certainly the most effective way of getting any of those big fish, if you want to make sure that you're getting them if they are there would be putting block nets in to prevent them from escaping. Because that's certainly something I think we see happen. You're kind of walking in the stream with your electrofishing equipment, and your susceptibility to the electric current depends on the body size. So if you're standing there and you dip your finger in the water, you might feel a tingle, but it's not going to do much. But if you fall in face first, you're gone. And it's the same thing with fish. Those bigger fish are going to detect that current coming. So there's very likely a chance that some of those big ones can't escape. But again, I wouldn't say
I kind of understand that, you have to be very consistent in all your studies. So you can't just come out with this, this fish net upstream 300 meters unless it's always been done.
Yeah.
Otherwise your data doesn't count.
Right. But, I would say in this study, we did get some of those bigger fish, didn't get them all the time. I would suspect if you have that habitat that supports those bigger fish, they're, unless people are harvesting them, they're likely there. And some years we get them, some years we don't. But that wasn't necessarily the main goal of this, is, catching those really big fish, the 18, 20 inches or whatever, but more looking at the growth response of the vast majority of the numbers of fish that are there. So more in that 10 to 15 inch range.
Thank you.
So, Matt, what does the conclusions from the study, how does that inform fishing regulations?
Well, there was a regulation that did come out kind of around the time we were doing this study. Some of you probably know there's, I think, at least 3 streams in the Driftless area where there's a kind of, it's a special regulation, kind of experimental 10 bag limit. Bohemian, I think, is one of them. Mormon Coulee might be another one. The third one's escaped me. But so we did
South Branch of the Bad Axe.
Yeah, that's right. South Fork of Bad Axe. So we do have some of those regulations out there, but it really hasn't been expanded beyond that. And I guess I'd say it'll come up again the next time the DNR trout team does a regulation review. And then maybe at that point, these study results might be considered in, plus the data that's collected on those 10 bag streams to determine, is this a regulation worth expanding, getting rid of, whatever.
Yeah,
Matt, can I get
those streams too have been really hit hard by the impacts of the heavy rainfalls. So it's got to be a difficult set of data to get your arms around and come up with some decisions. So that will be interesting to see.
Yeah, and that's one of the useful things of I kept on Spring Coulee as a trend site, so I have that trend data to use as kind of control data for other studies as well. And we were in Spring Coulee this fall, and I'm sure some of you saw the floods that happened. I guess it was late August this year. Really did a number on Spring Coulee again. Rod's farm just got destroyed, and it is not the same stream that it was when we did this study originally. But we went through there and did our surveys, and it was just as loaded with trout this fall as it was the fall before. There was a somewhat difference in size structure. A lot of as you would expect in a big flood like that, a lot of young year fish were lost. And we didn't see some of the really big fish either, but kind of within that mid-range, there were just still a lot of fish there. You wouldn't even, just by looking at the data, outside of not seeing the young year fish, it wouldn't have been obvious that there was a flood there.
Well, that's very encouraging.
So Matt, can I give you a little history lesson?
Sure.
On Timber Coulee many years ago, Dennis Groppe bet Dave Petrano that if he would close off Timber Coulee from Highway P up to Olstead Road, that the fish would get much bigger. They had many arguments over this, and Dennis owned a fly shop down in Coon Valley. And finally, Dave got mad and says, okay, I'll just do it. So he changed the regulations. And as it was, of course, he did, numerous surveys up through there. And as it was, there was no size structure difference. It's just like, there's only so much food coming down the pipe. And that's it.
Yep, that makes sense to me.
This is a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine, especially after a big flood like we saw this past year, that's got to clean out a lot of food as well and make for some really hungry trout. Sure, you see that when you fish there.
So that means we can be pretty careless with how we tie our flies. They'll take almost anything that I would be capable of tying.
That may very well be the case right after a big flood. Yep.
Kirk Olson did a study, and he got lucky. He did a stream survey up on Timber Coulee, and I'm up by the snowmobile bridge before a big flood a couple of years ago, and got a chance to come back there in just a couple of weeks after the flood, and basically found no difference in amount of fish that was there.
Yep.
So sometimes the floods really don't make a whole lot of difference in the actual amount of fish left.
Yeah, I will add, I talked to Rod Ofty after that flood that happened this year, and or rather he contacted me. He saw a fair number of trout up in his field after that flood. I guess he hadn't noticed that or hadn't seen that in previous floods. So I guess it can happen that some of those floods do kill some larger fish, but again, the densities in the stream are so great that that number of fish that he saw, stranded by the flood, didn't really make a noticeable difference in the stream.
We had one question come in through the chat. Anne asked if did the reduction in fish affect aquatic vegetation or the mass of bugs in the area you studied?
It's not something we looked at. I suspect it wouldn't have made a difference on the vegetation, and for the inverts, again, I would probably say not much of a difference, particularly because we only did this in a small section of the stream. It's not like we reduced the density over the entire stream. But again, it's not something we measured, so I really don't have any data on that. Well, if there are no other questions, I'll just move on.